Okay, good evening, everybody. I hope I can speak as loud. I will speak as loud as possible so everybody can hear me. I know it's not a big auditorium, but I know it's 5:20. Probably many of us are ready to go home. First, I would like to thank everyone for coming here, for taking the time and joining us today for this exciting event. I would like also to thank our long-standing experts for taking the time, despite their busy schedule, to come here today and speak to us and enrich our knowledge about both Mali and Sudan. Before kicking this off, I would like to also thank the government of the Netherlands for its continuous support for the SANA project, which stands for Security Assessment in North Africa project, which has been alive for 12 years now. I would like to also thank the Small Arms Survey for hosting this event. Today we'll listen to two stories of conflict that started basically more or less around the fall of the Gaddafi regime, the heavily armed Gaddafi regime in 2011. That conflict had cross-border impact that affected the neighbors of Libya in various ways. Essentially, instability in Libya contributed to the spreading of conflicts in the region, not only in the region but even beyond. Mali was among the first to receive the impact of the Libyan security challenges. The spillover effect of the Libyan conflict into Mali also took several formats, including but not limited to the flow of illicit arms. The spillover effect of the Libyan conflict has been further expanding without any promises of retraction, especially with massive displacement and catastrophic humanitarian situation. Now, the most recent regional crisis is what's happening in Sudan. Sudan, again, is connected to Libya in various complex ways. In the spring of 2023, Sudan entered a new cycle of violence that threatens the entire country, but also the region as well. Events both in Mali and Sudan may have grave consequences for regional peace and security, including in Libya. The entire region already suffers from devastating activities of violent extremist non-state actors, of rising proliferation of small arms and light weapons among various actors in the region, which stands behind serious concerns about the security situation in the region as a whole. Now, I'll leave it for the speakers, but let me first introduce them. We have Jalel Harchaoui, a SANA expert and a Libya specialist, an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, who will speak to us about the Sudan-Libya connection and its new ramifications since April 2023. We also have Holger Anders, who sits on that side of the room, who's an independent researcher and will present an update on the security situation in Mali and discuss the possible future of the country. Jalal, would you like to start?
Yeah, with pleasure. Thank you, Laura. Thank you very much to the SANA program of Small Arms Survey, with which I've been associated since 2016, and that association really means the world to me. I wanted to speak to you today about the international dimension of the Sudan conflict that has been unfolding since April 15th, but I didn't want it coming across as implying that this is a traditional proxy war, or whether it's a proxy war at all. From a security, political, and corruption perspectives, the formal, on the one hand, referring to General Burhan, and the informal General Daglo or Hamati, offspring of the not yet defunct regime of Omar al-Bashir, those two forces over the years have been had enough space and had enough tranquility to accumulate resources, to accumulate military materiel, fighters, international connections, and kleptocratic ventures for them to be able to propel and nourish the war alone. So this idea that some foreign actors have decided to pull Sudan into a conflict is absolutely false, and I'd like to reject it. So it might sound contradictory, but it's important to not exaggerate the international dimension. Regarding this split or dichotomy between the two main forces, I remember what you would typically see in a think tank report about that worrisome situation. What you would typically see is a recommendation for a proper SSR, a security sector reform, with this advice to integrate the RSF into the formal regular forces. And of course, this kind of recommendation doesn't take into consideration the fact that the business activities are distinct, thriving, and growing. And I think this idea of not just having illicit activities on the side, but really having them grow over time is absolutely crucial to understand, for instance, the connection between Sudan and Libya. I wanted to begin by offering a very brief synoptic timeline of the conflict as it has unfolded since April 15th, because I think the various phases are useful to mentally visualize the two modes in which the international dimension could evolve going forward. But before I do that, I wanted to quote a Chadian official that had spoken to the French newspaper Le Monde just 5 days into the conflict. And that Chadian official, who went unnamed, said, we, the Déby government, Mohamed Kaka Déby, we are on the side of the institution. So by that he referred to the regular forces, the formal institutions, as opposed to the militias of the rapid support forces. Our government in N'Djamena is silent so far because the situation is still uncertain. In other words, we don't know who will win. But for us, Chadians, referring to the government, not necessarily the population, a seizure of power by an irregular force dominated by many Arabs from the Chad-Sudan border area would be a threat to our stability. So you already see the dichotomy between formal institution, or at least supposedly formal institution on the one hand, and irregular forces on the other, and you already see one key perception on the part of the government in N'Djamena that believes that if the situation in Darfur deteriorates because the RSF is given the opportunity to basically go on a rampage, then this will have, in several steps, existential consequences on the current government in N'Djamena. So that's actually one key to the analysis that I wanted to share today. But in terms of what happened really when the conflict erupted in mid-April, for the first 2 weeks there was no clear battle lines. There was basically a very thick fog of war kind of situation. And a lot of the leaders, a lot of the principals were killed or kidnapped or ran away. And there was no clarity, although the actors had been preparing for this conflict for several months. We remember, for example, the more than week spent by General Hameti in Abu Dhabi, clearly posing with the president of the United Arab Emirates, and also there was already reports even before the war that there were actually hundreds of men sent by Hameti to Benghazi to prepare some kind of an event. And there were other signs that actors were preparing. So of course, all the ceasefires were completely ignored during the first 2 weeks, and there was a perception that the international community was by and large going to side with the regular armed forces, the Burhan forces, because the other one had been associated with the atrocities of 15 or 20 years ago in Darfur. It was clearly closer to Russia, so that would imply that Washington would have as a knee-jerk reaction marked sympathy with tangible consequences towards the Sudanese armed forces. There was also this assumption that, yes, the RSF had the time to grow and become wealthy, but you cannot compete with 100 years of institutionalized discipline, and the armed forces were going to prevail. And what we discovered was that, yes, maybe the SAF, the Sudanese armed forces, had the ability to conduct airstrikes, they had other advantages, but on a pure infantry level, in terms of just ground battles, there was more strength, apparently, on the side of the RSF. And in terms of the reaction of the international community, it was a little bit slow, a little bit weaker than people would have hoped. And there was no real clear idea on how to create leverage, and even as to which forum was going to prevail. There was much importance associated with Saudi Arabia, with the Jeddah talks at the time. But in the end, it was the SAF that walked out of the Jeddah talks. And by May, we also discovered that the SAF were not the Western-style armed structure with a clear chain of command. People didn't know it was going to siphon away the humanitarian aid deliveries, and that it was going to expel the UN special envoy and that kind of thing. So the clarity of the clarity that was expected in terms of the international reaction didn't materialize, and as the battle lines became clearer, there was more willingness to kind of see the two forces as kind of equivalent, morally and otherwise. In the end, we're seeing effectively a relatively resilient RSF compared to the initial perception, and now we doesn't, obviously, despite the growing genocidal almost dimension of what is happening in Darfur, there's no end in sight. And here what I was interested in doing is basically remind you of a moment that I thought was pretty symbolic. It happened on the 7th of May, relatively early. The special envoy of the United States, responsible for the Libya file, visited N'Djamena. And it was a time where clearly Egypt was showing a lot of sympathy towards N'Djamena. And there was this idea that had been discussed behind the scenes that maybe the US was interested in encouraging maybe a change in armed forces intervention in Darfur, a preemptive one, for the reasons that I mentioned at the beginning. And so you would have basically an alignment, Egypt with obviously clearly in favor of Burhan, would help the Syrian army intervene, and then you would have potentially the interest of Saudi Arabia to kind of help against RSF and in favor of Burhan, for example, through the donation of money and just being there. And so you would have like this, these four international actors that would work together in order to prevent expected atrocities in Darfur, and that would be useful because it was going to be against the RSF, and then you would have effectively the Egyptian school of thought being supported through tangible action, military action, and of course you had the Russian specter behind the scenes. Everybody knew that yes, Russia had connections with both main forces in Sudan, but was clearly closer to the RSF. So any bad news for the RSF would be good news for Washington, and maybe if it was going to be a success in the Sudan, maybe the momentum would be useful to continue doing what the US had committed to doing in Libya anyway. Everybody remembers the very high-profile visits by the CIA director, Bill Burns, in Libya, had stopped in person, the most senior official in more than 15 years, to visit Libya in order to warn everyone that the US was now going to take very seriously this idea that Russia had to be expelled from Libya. So if the Sudanese action was going to make this even easier in Libya, then why not? And those were the ideas that were being discussed at the time. And so this means that effectively the Emirati perception was obviously not considered. It was too cynical. And here I would like to remind everyone that, of course, the Emiratis had been quite happy with its connection with the RSF of Hamati. I mean, of course, one moment where the RSF turned out to be quite useful for the Emiratis was the Yemen war. It was, of the two forces, the one that was most agile, most willing to follow this mercenary logics and send men and be of direct utility to the interferers, the interveners in Yemen. And there was also the Ethiopian precedent. The RSF didn't play a big role, but had tried to prevent Egypt from helping the Tigray army during this very murderous war that unfolded between 2020 and 2022. So the Emirates obviously continued helping the RSF recycle the gold. That has been a very key locale in terms of monetizing the gold. There was also indications that a lot of the propaganda efforts on behalf of the RSF had been conducted out of the Emirates. And the narrative at the time was that political Islam, or the Muslim Brotherhood of the Omar al-Bashir era, had been able to survive within the regular armed forces, and by construction, supporting RSF was a good and safe way to be against political Islam. So those kind of arguments sounded ridiculous at the beginning, but they gained traction over time because it helped basically avoid taking any action. So, if you, in my head visually, I always view it as very useful to remember those moments in May, typically, where a firmer attitude on the part of Egypt, on the part of Chad, on the part of the United States itself, maybe on the part of France, to do what seemed to be logical and plausible and relatively safe. And I'm not saying it was going to be safe. For example, there are some anti-Déby Chadian armed groups in the Central African Republic that could be unleashed by the RSF if the Chadians had actually shown greater aggressiveness in Darfur. So, but this idea of a potential scenario that had been actually discussed or sketched out, at least, is a good thing to remember, because it allows you to realize that the international community is quite passive as opposed to that kind of scenario. It also reminds you that maybe if things go too far, because we're still too early in the conflict, it's possible that those same ideas might come back to the forefront, and maybe they would be implemented in some way or other. And I'd like to now devote a few minutes to what it is that the armed coalition of the Libyan armed group leader or commander, Khalifa Haftar. I should really refer to his sons, because we're talking about an 80-year-old man who doesn't have many hours of activity per day. The initiative, the instigation usually stem from his sons. He has 6 sons, and 2 or 3 of them are particularly active. And the most active one is a gentleman by the name of Saddam Haftar. Anyway, I will refer to the Haftar family. Haftar family has been supported by the Emirates since 2014, really. So from Abu Dhabi's perspective, it's really almost a creature of the Emirates. And there's, of course, this influence of the Emirates, but I'd like to ask you to just imagine the area, or at least Libya, without the influence of the Emirates and without the presence, the continued presence of Russia. My argument would be to say that just because of the illicit activity dimension that has been allowed to flourish over the years, including between Sudan and Libya, just because of that aspect alone, you have enough incentive and you have enough reasons to be able to explain the behavior of the Haftar family vis-a-vis the Sudan war. And what is that behavior? It basically has consisted in continuing the illicit activities that had been around for years. And we're talking about, not all of them survived, but what we had before April 15th was effectively a flow of stolen cars, like typically cars stolen in Europe, moved into Sudan. You had narcotics, Captagon exported by the Syrian regime, for instance, flowing into Egypt and flowing mainly into Sudan. You had food, of course, and you had human smuggling going into to the western part of Libya, actually. Once those humans had spent enough time in the Kufra area, which features some of the worst detention centers, they would be sent in several steps to the western part of the Libyan coast. And then, of course, fuel. So fuel is a very easy to get form of wealth in Libya. Libya is an oil producer, but it imports $1 billion worth of fuel every year, including billions that are not justified. In other words, by construction, you could determine or prove that several billions worth of fuel imported by this energy producer is effectively dedicated to trafficking, diversion, theft, and all kinds of smuggling. So you could argue that one source of revenue from the RSF perspective before the war was in the form of those deliveries of fuel from the southeastern corner of Libya. Of course, the meaning of that activity has changed. So when you analyze those activities before April 15th, you found out that most of the interlocutors of those actors in the southeastern corner of Libya were actually RSF linked. It was not typically, those people were not facing off in terms of their business dealings. They were not working with the army, they were working with the RSF. So when the war erupted, of course, they focused on doing what was feasible, what actually made sense logistically, which is to continue delivering the fuel, which is exactly what has been happening. And of course, it is a war where fuel is particularly vital. In terms of the actual military material, the ammunition, weapons, there have been deliveries. But I'd like to say that the inflow into Libya for those deliveries to continue or to be sustained in a very aggressive manner, those inflows have not happened. So here I would like to just remind everyone that there was a war ongoing in Libya until June 2020, when it just stopped abruptly. And it stopped in a situation where the Haftar coalition was weak on the ground, but its weakness was never due to the fact that it was lacking material. It was actually quite rich with toys and hardware, and a lot of it had been provided by the Emirates already at the time. So when the war stopped, Haftar ended up the loser, had to go home back in the east, but kept a lot of the inventories that were supposed to go into achieving his victory in the west. So what has been happening is that this inventory has been depleted. That's the reason we have not seen an inflow from the outside, which could happen in the future. But I'm not someone who would attach a lot of importance to those injections. I think the fuel, and of course it comes with food and water, but the fuel is absolutely strategic and crucial. And that is already a form of foreign intervention. So here I'd like to finish by just saying that there are, of course, other actors. There are reports, unconfirmed reports, of potentially 6 to 8 TB2 drones delivered by Turkey. Turkey has been sympathetic towards the SAF, and it's possible that those drones were already delivered, which would mean that they would move into operation within the next few weeks. There's also some officials who believe that the Sudanese armed forces have acquired maybe surveillance drones from Iran. We saw in Baku just a couple of weeks ago that officially the Khartoum government, in other words, the SAF, has restored its diplomatic relations with Iran, so it's a possibility. And the last thing that I wanted to kind of insert here is this supposed field hospital that is in the process of being built in the eastern part of Chad, next door from Darfur, in Jeres. So it's a small field hospital, just 50 beds apparently, and that warranted almost 50 cargo flights from the Emirates, all stemming from a military base. So it's possible, and we will see it in the next few weeks, it's possible that this is a form of intervention on the part of the Emirates. Here, of course, what would be remarkable is that the Emirates, through the promise of financial aid and of course the use of its diplomatic standing, has apparently been able to convince Chad, and my first remark in this presentation is that Chad is supposed to feel existentially threatened. Maybe it's possible, I actually believe that, the UAE has convinced Chad to just take it easy, sit down, and maybe let the UAE use part of the territory to support the RSF. So again, I think the two modes that I described, this complacency on the part of Western nations, which allows, the last few facts that I described to continue manifesting on a daily basis, or maybe a return to a firmer form of action that could maybe help stop the deterioration in Darfur. Thank you very much.
I think Holger.
That's right. Hello everyone, my name is Holger Anders. I've been working in Mali for the last couple of years. So thank you also for having me, and thought it'd be a good time to provide an update as Mali is on the news at the moment. Also prepared a wonderful presentation. There we go. And notice the question mark in brackets. It's the whole thing. So, what I want to talk about is, as I don't know how much everybody knows, just to give you a quick background on Mali, and then talk about the different crises, which are actually all happening in parallel at the moment, to then give you an update on what is currently happening, and then attempt a forecast to see where everything is going. So for the background, for those of you who don't know, there was an armed rebellion in northern Mali in 2011, as I said, very much linked to what happened in Libya at the time. In 2012, that rebellion in northern Mali was hijacked by extremist actors, which are Al-Qaeda linked Katibas, which had been operating in that area for a while already. In response to this spread of Al-Qaeda groups, the international community got involved. French forces arrived in Mali to liberate the major population centers in the north. And this one was followed by the UN mission in 2013, mid-2013 MINUSMA. However, neither the French nor MINUSMA were particularly successful in denting the spreading insecurity. In 2015, the northern extremist groups managed a significant expansion by getting a complete new set of actors involved in the ideologically motivated violence against the government. And this has been going, continued also down to the south and the border with Cote d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso. And 5 years later, situation still hadn't improved, and you had a military coup d'etat, which the military then repeated the year later just to make sure that they were really in control and no civilians interfering. What I find interesting about Mali is that typically when I read Western newspapers about Mali, it's all very much focused on the extremist violence. That is, the violence perpetrated by the Al-Qaeda-linked groups, or by now you also have Islamic State-linked groups operating there. But very often all this is conflated into that is a problem in Mali. Well, it's one of the many problems in Mali. The violent extremism certainly is the main cause of insecurity in terms of physical security of military personnel, police personnel, civilians, obviously. And it's not the only challenge Mali is facing. As I said in the very beginning, 2011, we had a rebellion. And nowadays we would call them secular rebels, just to make a distinction with the religiously influenced extremist groups. And in 2015, there was a peace agreement then between these rebel groups and the government, and that peace process has not been going anywhere quickly at all. Actually, 6 months ago, the coalition of rebel groups in northern Mali declared that they're no longer participating in the peace process because they weren't getting what they were looking for. They're accusing the military regime at the moment of completely ignoring the demands and the agreements that had been made previously. So the peace process is actually a separate crisis from the extremist violence, and different actors involved in different trajectories. And to make the trio complete, you still have the intention of a return to constitutional order in Mali, which would mean national democratic elections happening next year, at which point then the optimistic Western perception is that after a 4-year detour into a military coup d'etat regime, Mali having democratic elections and coming back into the fold of democratic, well-meaning, respected states. Now, all these three issues are causing a very poor situation. And what the military also did in the meantime is kick out the French armed forces, as they would like to pretend, which is not quite true. The French said they're withdrawing from Mali in 2020. And the government then said, well, we don't actually want you, so you better leave more quickly than you already intended to do. Instead, the military regime turned towards Russia for military assistance, and together with their private military security partner, the Malian armed forces have started a counter-terrorism operation, several operations in central Mali since 2021, the end of 2021. These counter-terrorist operations are paralleled by various allegations of serious violations of international humanitarian law and human rights. And it also has to be said that actually the number of extremist attacks in central Mali has been going down for the last year, which one could reasonably assume may indeed be an effect of the counter-terrorism operations, simply because I would think in the beginning it's the easiest to get the easy targets, make the biggest impact, but despite nearly 2 years now of running these operations, the extremists are still very much present in central Mali and are still very much operating in central Mali. What is happening probably is that the activities of the extremist groups is a lot more moving into the countryside, where there aren't that many people to report on it. So international community is not well placed even in that things. As I said, the current Malian regime is reorienting its foreign policy framework towards Russia, of course, but certainly not only Russia. There are increasingly friendly and deep cooperation agreements and arrangements between also the Malian regime and China, Malian regime and Iran, Malian regime and Turkey, and North Korea as well. North Korea I'll come back to in a second. In the meantime, and this is why MINUSMA and Mali are in the news again, as you will have heard 2 weeks ago, or actually months ago, the Malian government said MINUSMA has to withdraw immediately from Mali. We don't want them any longer. They are not helping us in achieving what we want to achieve, which from the perspective of the Malian military regime is completely correct, as MINUSMA is not engaging into counter-terrorism operations. Now that is for 2 reasons. First reason, MINUSMA absolutely would not have the capacity, understanding, knowledge, training, or background to actually do counter-terrorism operations. So it's actually very good thing. The Security Council never gave MINUSMA an offensive counter-terrorism mandate, I would think. At the same time, exactly, MINUSMA wasn't there to combat counter-terrorism, so MINUSMA is getting kicked out for the wrong reasons, so to speak. In the sense of MINUSMA is accused of not helping to combat terrorism, but MINUSMA isn't there to combat terrorism, it's there for the peace process, which I would say many people in Mali don't really care about that much. Mali, you can mentally imagine, as 3 different states, the south, the center, and the north, with the current regime in the south having a very old established line of thinking towards the north, which is those people up north are supposed to do what we tell them because we're the central government. And if not, we can almost go and force them to do what we want, which is probably something they will try again. So for the moment, MINUSMA is scheduled to leave within the next month, and then obviously one of the elements will be what is the expected impact. MINUSMA didn't really have much of a deterrent effect on the extremist actors. So I would assume that MINUSMA withdrawing from Mali will not change much in terms of the extremist violence, because MINUSMA is basically spending 90% of its resources on protecting itself and its convoys and its camps. So there isn't really much to be done in terms of protecting civilians. One of my big criticisms really is also New York and the people who drafted the resolutions or the political context. MINUSMA was given an impossible job with, on the one hand, supporting the government authorities and extending their authority, but at the same time being neutral, objective, and impartial when dealing with the rebel groups, which already doesn't quite work if you don't have both sides being side by side. Then, as I said, the Malian regime is by now purely interested in military operations to counter their extremist threat. And at the same time, you still have people in the government as well as among the rebel groups who are saying that probably war will be inevitable between the central government and the northern rebels, because the issue simply hasn't been solved and has not been solved diplomatically for the last 10 years either. So with MINUSMA withdrawing, you're removing a buffer between these 2 actors, and that could really have unfortunate consequences. If I were to write a script for a Netflix series, I would start saying that MINUSMA withdraws from Kidal in northern Mali. Kidal is one of the main areas where things are happening. MINUSMA withdraws from Kidal. The Malian armed forces go into Kidal to take over the military camp. The local rebel groups say that's not what they had in mind and wanted at all, and the government will say, well, it's our country, we can do what we want. That's really kind of the logic of the approach they have. And I'm not putting words into their mouths, it's their own wording. And then you can imagine very easily some incident at a local checkpoint in the evening and shooting happening, and you are back into the conflict setting with now Malian army having significantly increased its air assets and capacities thanks to the Russian support. So if you really wanted to go down worst case scenario, you can imagine Kidal being bombed, with then the government taking over the rest of what is there, which will also not help anything, because if you know northern Mali, it's a vastly deserted area. If you don't like being in the town, you go 2 kilometers to the left or the right, which is how the extremists have been operating for the last decade there. It's easy enough to not be in towns, because every food, every water, everything else is based on transfer and transit from elsewhere in any case, because you have absolutely no livestock herding there, more food production. So basically you can imagine a government being in control of the main population centers and control in a very forceful manner, with much of the countryside being left to its own devices, which is being run by other people with weapons, which probably would be an extremist in that case. Also, what probably will happen, to the extent that MINUSMA did have a positive impact, of course, local and civil affairs activities, these things, they will of course all come to an end. Force protection for humanitarian convoys will come to an end, which is an issue for those NGOs who, or those humanitarian actors who by now agreed on wanting to have protection. But the situation in Mali has really developed to an extent that if you don't have armed protection, it's a very bad idea to drive through the country anywhere. So humanitarian aid delivery is certainly going to be a big challenge, if that will continue at all. And a colleague of mine was raising her fears of, as soon as MINUSMA withdrawing, there'll be all these reports of camps of internally displaced people being attacked, massacres happening, and strictly speaking, no, we will not have these reports because there's no one left to report. So from the international community, you can very much expect Mali to become less and less visible, simply because there's no information any longer being fed into the international consciousness, if you want. So here then, towards an uncertain future, some of the things I already mentioned, I think it's a distinct possibility that Mali will be like certain other African countries where you have central government control restricted to the major towns, and everything else is up for grabs. As I said, with MINUSMA being taken out, there is also a distinct chance of violence restarting between the government and the rebel groups. Again, with MINUSMA preventing this from happening makes it more likely. And I also have to say, I'm painting a worst case scenario. I would be very delighted if all of this turns out not to be right. But in the spirit of things and how things have developed in other countries, I think this would be risks to have. What I meant with militarization of the state, we were talking about Tunisia earlier today and some tendencies of how to control local populations. These things are happening in Mali as well. We have arrests of journalists who are starting to, or journalists who dare to criticize the government. We had a UN human rights investigative report about a massacre in central Mali last year, to which the Malian government responded with starting legal proceedings against the authors of the report for defaming Mali and its military armed forces. You know all these things from other places. My point is, it's happening in Mali now as well. We didn't see that in Mali in the past, but now we're certainly there. And then the embedded anti-Western policies. I mentioned North Korea. Now, for me, it's a big thing. I don't know whether anybody else can get excited about it. But for the last 1 month and a half, there is public source information and knowledge that the Malian regime is currently negotiating the construction of an ammunition plant in Bamako. It's a sovereign choice. That's what you want to do as military, have your own ammunition, that's all good. But they decided to do that with North Korea. If that thing goes through, it's in any possible violation of the North Korea sanctions at the Security Council. North Korea has been doing that with a couple of other African states in the past decades. But at least in the last 5 years, whenever any such thing became public knowledge, the governments eventually withdrew their cooperation agreements with North Korea to avoid the international blowback of openly violating the Security Council sanctions. My whole point with the current regime in Mali would be these people are not from any diplomatic background. They really don't care what France has to say or what I have to say or what this UN Security Council has to say. It's not their reference point, it's not what they consider important, and that they continue apparently the negotiations with North Korea, despite the fact that this is now in the newspapers, kind of gives you a feeling of how little leverage, if any, the Western world could have on Mali, if it ever had any to start off with. So, why the question mark in brackets about the future of Mali? Because I hope that I'm wrong. And next time you see, I will be pleased to hear that I was wrong. And if not, Mali is going to be locked into a foreign policy framework with Russia, China, North Korea, Iran for many, many years to come. Because even if you have democratic elections next year in Mali, as planned, I think it's a fairly safe bet to assume that whichever government will be reflected will toe line with the previous masters and not completely ignore the military and its wishes, because then you have coup number 3 already predestined. The point is, whoever will be elected next year will already be caged into a foreign policy framework that will define Mali's position with China, Russia, other actors, I think for decades to come. So from the Western perspective, I would think Mali is going to be a very disheartening and sombering experience, because you have 10 years of presumably well-known international attention and money being thrown at the thing, and presumably like Afghanistan, not resulting in what initially was intended. Thank you.
I guess we'll start the Q&A period. If there are any questions. Okay, yes.
I have 2 questions, one for Ustaz Jalal and one for Holger as well. So Jalal, thank you very much for highlighting the role of the Emirates. Basically, I live in Versoix. I see the Emirates plane flying in 3 times a day, and because it's the loudest, it's the biggest one. Each time I shake my fist towards the sky, basically. And of course, in Western media, I find that the Russian role is really, that's the tasty one for obvious reasons, you know, self-centered interests and so forth. So my question is that I was wondering, basically, because Gaddafi had been a very destabilizing force in Sudan for a long time. I mean, starting in the mid-70s, you know, supporting a number of coup attempts and, you know, being a early supporter of the SPLA rebels in what was then Southern Sudan, and then the JAM rebels, of course, also in the 2000s. So my question would be, you know, isn't Sudan, meaning the Sudanese, basically better off, you know, now? I mean, isn't Libya's role much diminished if you compare it to Gaddafi? And to Holger, I wanted to ask, you know, there has been much also very racist talk in Sudan about, these RSF, you know, Hemeti, they're not real Sudanese, they're from Chad, they're, you know, from Mali. And the Small Arms Survey has also traced ammunition from the Sudanese ammunition factory, which, by the way, was originally built by West Germany. that has ended up in Mali. And so I was wondering, you know, have you seen any Mali, Sudan connections in your work?
There have been flows of fighters coming from various countries in the Sahel, including Burkina Faso, including Mali, and it's probably not major, but it has been happening, and we could already analytically begin asking ourselves what would happen after the conflict, or after maybe one party gets demolished by the other. What would these fighters do? But regarding your first question about, you know, are the Sudanese better off today? I don't think anybody is better off, because I think the definition of the state, or the sacrosanct aspect of the state and the state borders, all those traditional concepts were much more tangibly defended in the old days. And what we're seeing is now foreign interventions, or foreign forms of interference happening simply because they can. And I think the current global order, just because of lack of response from Western democracies, but also direct participation on the part of all the regional powers, and a lot of things are just happening before our eyes, and it's much more fragmented, much more disjointed, and a lot of weird stuff is happening that didn't happen back in the day. I mean, you wouldn't build, like, for example, what the Emirates has done in Libya is like build an air base in front of everyone during the peace talks in Morocco, within the context of an arms embargo, and nobody mentioned it. Like, it was really mentioned when the air base was finally ready, and it was mentioned by some obscure trade magazine. So I think that these things didn't happen back in the day, and you would have to, like, take in the fighters, train them, arm them, and then send them back. And here, this is much more complex. And there was an article in Foreign Policy that said that Sudan is a proxy war between the Saudis and the UAE. Of course, there's a kernel of truth behind that, but it's, I think, the wrong reading. And some of my friends responded by saying, no, I mean, the UAE continues to speak with the Saudis. And I think it's more that version that we should bear in mind, is everybody continues talking to each other, and the interference programs that occur internationally, they are happening simply because everybody is silent. So it's really the global order that we should question, and I don't think we should compare what is happening now to what was happening 30 years ago.
If I may, I will correct you. It was a small observation. Yes, there is Sudanese produced military material in the conflict in Mali, and very much concentrated in the hands of the northern extremist groups. For a very simple and straightforward reason, it comes from Libya. Whatever you find in Libya circulating, you can, well, let me start somewhere else. Whatever I find in Mali, in literally 90% of the cases, if I trace that stuff or look into it, I find the same material a year previously already showing up in Libya. And this is why I made the reference to the north, to the northern Mali rebel extremist groups, because they have the trafficking links with Libya. So yes, there is Sudanese military material in theater in Mali, but it has nothing to do with Sudan per se. Now, if Mali were to continue developing along the lines of what I suggested, and Sudan wouldn't be in the process of imploding, yes, then it would make perfect sense of the Malian regime taking up contacts with the Sudanese regime, because the Sudanese have been famous for decades now to provide military material to whoever has problems getting it elsewhere more easily. So, no direct connection, but yes, there are links, and there are some super interesting little anecdotes. We had an attack in Timbuktu, another town in northern Mali, in 2018, with one of the assailants who was killed in the attack having the uniform of the rapid support forces. Which, again, that was one person, doesn't mean even the person could have bought that uniform unrelated. Don't forget, all these things are, of course, integrated economic spaces as well. It's not that different from being in Switzerland and finding a British coin on the street. So yes, it's there, but nothing structured, nothing strategic, nothing anybody in Sudan having intention and focus on supplying to Mali, to other government, or governments.
Shall we take the next question? If there's any?
Yes, please.
I was wondering, what is the timetable for MINUSMA's withdrawal? How is it supposed to occur?
It is on a 3-month drawdown phase, whatever that means, and a 3-month withdrawal. So the mandate now with these 2 brackets goes until 31st December this year, after which starts the liquidation phase. What that means, I have no idea. But it's contracts, it's finances, it's... But if you're interested in what it actually practically means, I'm not sure that MINUSMA knows itself what it means, because it very successfully avoided even considering the fact that it may get thrown out. Of course, yes, they will need to vacate their camps. In northern Mali, the first question will be who will take over the camps. I made the scenario of the government coming in, taking over the MINUSMA camps, which previously were Malian army camps in any case. Yes, the Malian state is reclaiming its space, but if they do that in the north without at least the tacit consent of the rebel groups, it's a recipe for new clashes. Then a whole lot of practical things to be done, and yes, I think for the moment, imagine MINUSMA like the ostrich with its head in the sand and hoping that good things will happen when it lifts its head. Yeah, the mandate is for 6 months. In 6 months time, everyone's supposed to be out. I would assume it's going to get quicker than that. But at the moment, everybody is just staring into the sky and hoping that what they actually heard and saw is not something. It's a weird situation, though.
I have a question, please. You didn't spoke about the role of China in this region in Mali. So could you precise something about that?
Yes, the role of China in Mali is the same as the role of China anywhere else in Africa. It's provision of building roads, hospitals, or they support military material, and the whole thing without interfering in domestic politics.
Soft power.
Right?
So this is the soft power way?
Yes, soft power with arms and ammunition on top of it. But yeah, no, for the Chinese, I mean, it's really straightforward. And the same thing with the logic with the North Koreans, Iranians. Mali has natural resources which are up for grabs. So, of course, there's a whole lot of people interested in it. For the moment, I think the biggest gold exploiter in Mali is still Canada. But it's going to be interesting to see how much longer Canadian firms want to operate in an area that is becoming increasingly insecure. Which is kind of an unfair argument because the gold mines are in the southwest, where the Canadians are operating, which is the least affected area so far. But yeah, no, just to say, natural resources will be up for grabs. The government, the current Mali government, presumably will negotiate its contracts not in terms of money, but in terms of this is the access. And coming back to my fantastic Netflix series idea, I'm thinking of Gao Airport, actually the third big town in the north. Imagine Gao Airport in 2 years' time with North Korean planes arriving, unloading military material for Wagner to use in its operations against the rebel groups, while the same planes then are being uploaded with natural resources that go to Iran, from where the plane will continue back to North Korea. And it's not completely invented, that story is invented, but this is kind of the trajectory the current regime is on, and I maintain my point. Even if there are elections next year in democratically elected government, that is probably not going to change this trajectory, because the military will probably make sure that it will retain its fiefdoms. So what we didn't have before in Mali as well, but we know from other places, military becoming a state in the state. I think that's also a possibility for Mali. Hence why not terribly optimistic. And again, I mean, optimistic, it's not my point. Mali is a sovereign state, they can do what they want, it's fine. Also, of course, the question of how much the decision
But it
maker...
will be followed by the other country in the area, Burkina Faso, Chad, Niger.
The thing is, I'm on camera and I don't yet want to get thrown out of the country, so... I'm joking. But yes, no, China has no particular role other than providing without asking questions, and in return getting, I assume, natural resources.
This is for Jalel. Bearing in mind that this originated as a propaganda construct by the UAE, but is the South now making common cause? Is there any evidence that it's now making common cause with the Islamist remnants in Sudan? Is it sort of a case as with Yemen when Saudi Arabia was like, Iran is behind the Houthi for years, and then eventually that sort of came true by virtue of the conflict dynamics? Do you see any evidence of that emerging yet?
I mean, in my mind, it's the established fact that Omar al-Bashir, who's from the Muslim Brotherhood, had 3 decades to penetrate the regular armed forces. And he did. So the survivors from his camp, his political party, are in there. And to me, it's not even a matter of controversy. I think what we should view as controversial is that assuming that that fact is established, that you have a bunch of commanders or decision makers within the army that happen to operate based on their loyalty to the Muslim Brotherhood ideology. I think it's true, but let's assume that it's true for a minute. Is it enough of a reason for the Emirates to intervene just because of that? I don't think that's the main driver. I think the main driver is not ideological. I think what is happening in Sudan is really a clash between 2 perceptions of what a state should be for a poor country in Africa, from the point of view of the outside world, from the point of view of the Emirates. And I think what they see is, if you have a new Egypt emerge in Sudan, maybe it will not represent any ideological threat, but it's completely useless because it will be monolithical, it will be slow, it won't be agile. When you ask for a favor and go send fighters in some theater next door, they will say yes, 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 and then forget and not do it, like Egypt did with Yemen. And the corruption will not be particularly malleable, and you will not be able to institute any kind of mercenary logic, and everything will be bureaucratic. So this is not a piece of good news from the perspective of the Emirates, who is hell-bent on maximizing its influence in the region. In the region, if you have Hamatis everywhere, and if you have Saddam Haftars everywhere, and everything is fragmented, then it will be much easier to manage. Of course, the ideological aspect is taken care of, but also in terms of just the mechanics of how you transmit your influence is much easier. People are not going to, you basically influence them because the node of that corruption networks of those actors is in Dubai. You control their finances. If they need to pay Russia, they will have to go through Dubai to pay Russia. You're basically at home, and you just basically tell them what to do when you need them. And those 2 perceptions of the state. Do you want like a pyramid that is impenetrable, or do you want basically glorified militias everywhere? I think the Emirates because it's a small state, because it doesn't have much military experience, because it's rich financially, it prefers the other worldview. And I think this clash is much more interesting than any other kind of ideological. But the ideological dimension, to me, is there, and it's on the side that we discussed. In other words, the Muslim Brotherhood proponents are within the armed forces.
I have a question. Now that the conflict in Libya and the conflict in Mali are more or less 12 years old, and the conflict in Sudan is somewhat, like, the recent developments, let's put it this way, somewhat recent. What can we learn as the internet, from the perspective of the international community, from the experiences in Libya and Sudan and Mali? What can we learn regarding Sudan?
My personal lesson is that the West should be very much encouraged to consider and accept that it has absolutely no leverage. That was the biggest mistake Woodrow was going to start off with, thinking that somebody can down there and tell people how to do it better. Bad idea, bad choice, poorly influenced. So that's my 2 cents. Except that there are parts of the world where the Western world will have very little to say. So, sorry. I went to the Graduate Institute. I had expected loads of students. I wanted to do a thing on international relations theory. The more we're moving into a multipolar world, the more multilateral standards and constraints will be tested, which Mali is a perfect example for that. Mali is still very much interested in relations with everyone, at a bilateral level, on their terms. They are absolutely not interested in what they perceive as multilateral constraints and human rights. Things like that interfere with how they think they want to do things. That'd be my lesson.
I think I keep thinking about potentially one approach that maybe we should consider is, I always go back to this idea of, like, where are we in a conflict? Are we in the midst of an ideological clash? You know, for example, what happened in Libya right after the fall of Gaddafi was a very brazen form of ideological rivalry. People, there were a lot of actors who were armed to the hilt and were not very well organized when it came to penetrating institutions or stealing money, and they were just filled with weapons because of Qatar, because of other players at the time, and they just fought and they disappeared when it came to really being up to par in terms of corruption, competency, and ability to understand the value of getting into the institutions and manipulating them and all these things. So in terms of corruption cycle, we were quite early. It was more of a raw form of an ideological clash, and you could argue that you could predict it, or you could actually be forgiven for not predicting it. And then you have another stage of the cycle, is that when you let it simmer, and then the only actors who have survived are by definition very competent when it comes to corruption, and they are very well organized, including internationally, and they really have understood the value of their own institutions domestically. And then you let them evolve and flourish and become stronger, like what happened in Sudan for years and years of inaction, of the West not even trying. So that's why I don't necessarily agree with the idea that the West doesn't have any leverage, because I would believe it only when the West has become trying, and I haven't seen that. Then the new explosion of conflict to me is a different stage. It's not comparable to the first one, because it's about defending the kleptocratic empire that you have acquired. And you don't really care about ideology. Of course, if you can utilize ideology, you will. But that's not the main driver, like a much more younger form of conflict, like what you have after a big shock, and then you have all those actors obsessed with their ideology. So I think this distinction is useful, because if we all have it in mind, then you could predict the next Sudan. And I think Sudan was predictable. And I think all the Sudan specialists that are really deserve to be respected, and certainly not one of them, all the good ones have been saying that there was going to be a war. And they actually went on record saying it beforehand. So this is a different animal to me. And I think the West could make a difference. When we see sanctions hitting some, like, you know, the Haftar family or the Emirates, and then I will believe that the West is trying. I don't see the West trying.
I do.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Jalel and Mr. Holger. I learned a lot from you today. I was just like wondering about the DDR program in Mali. Why it's not successful? What are the factors of failing, or how we can, if we want to develop like even a DDR in the future in Libya, what is the main aspects that we can focus on and it will be something successful? Is it even DDR program successful?
The reason why the DDR progress in Mali didn't make much progress is more than anything else that the different stakeholders typically didn't agree on issues, or it took them months and years to go through it. The biggest issue at some point was providing the lists with names of people, and it took them, I think, 3 years going back and forth, and then the government said here, and then there isn't enough interest from either side to really make it happen. In addition to which, I actually started in DDR, and the only place I ever came across DDR working,
Colombia?
actually no, Cambodia, because it was 10 years after the conflict, because the situation was settled. And we just had a group of people who was willing to, or happy to get extra assistance, which wasn't really fair to the neighbors who were in the same situation and who didn't have access then to additional humanitarian funding. But how do you convince people to happily disarm if you have absolutely nothing to offer them for it? And the security situation wasn't really super conducive to you saying, hey, you know what, we're going to disarm because the guy who's going to attack me tomorrow with his arm, I can tell him, hey, I'm a civilian, I'm not going to get shot. Wasn't more either. And just for the history of it, Mali was the first place in 1996 that officially requested international assistance in the collection of small arms and from the Labé. That was 1996. Mali, big thing, small arms were, hey, first thing doing that. There was an additional lesson to be learned from Mali in 1996, which was that those villages which disarmed were raided, neighboring villages, shortly thereafter. And that again is one of these lessons in the DDR world which is completely ignored because it's annoying, it doesn't fit into your programming. So making DDR work, I think, requires combatants who are willing to disarm, and they're probably only willing to disarm if you actually offer them something concrete in the future, and if the security situation is conducive to combatants, ex-combatants. Thinking that neither of the two conditions are present in Mali, despite the fact that, yes, negotiations are ongoing, and at some point they will continue throwing money at people and organizations, but also doesn't change the fact that, as I was saying before, in northern Mali, there are no jobs to be had. There is very little. Certainly no agriculture, certainly no sustainable agriculture. How many motor shop repair shops can you have in one village with 200 people and 20 motorbikes? Probably also not that many. It's a challenging place out there, and no one has found an easy answer. Well, I certainly have.
Well, my answer on Libya would sound very, very similar on many points, not all. First of all, I mean, there's no real DDR program that has ever been actually launched in earnest in post-2011 Libya. And if you look at the environment, it's an environment where you have inflation the whole time, which means that most typical civil servant salaries are not enough and you prefer belonging to a militia. And also there's been an explosion in the number of civil servant positions, which means that people are getting jobs anyway. So there's another way, shortage of jobs, because you cannot make it sound like a reward for something hard to get, because everybody's getting it anyway. So you can still get your weapon because it's not conditional. And the other thing is, to move through space, like basically what you said, you don't, like if you got used to having an armed vehicle or a piece of a weapon, and you're going to be much better respected and you get used to it, even if you have no intention of being violent. So relinquishing that is absolutely unthinkable. So there's no, and even the scholarships abroad, where there's too much corruption in the form of actually this distribution of scholarship and training abroad. So you cannot even track people with that, because there are too many of them gotten unconditionally through connections through Western. So there's no room. There's no room to create an incentive for people to give up on their rights.
I think we'll have to stop right now. It's we're 7 minutes over the end time of this event. But before that, I'd like to thank the speakers, the attendees for being here. Super interesting discussion. Feel free to just approach the speakers if you have questions after or outside the room. So yeah, thank you very much.